Greetings. Those of you who live in Montana, at some point over the next few days, you may be hearing some huge groan. It'll be coming from a minister there, a friend of mine, because I'm going to tell a story he likes to tell. It's about the shortest man in the Bible. He fell asleep on his watch. I'm talking about watches today, though, for an important reason. Lately, I've been discussing the New Testament Passover. I've been talking about the Festival of Unleavened Bread. Of course, the New Testament Passover is also the Lord's Supper or Communion or Eucharist. We call it Remembrance Night. And I talked about the Festival of Unleavened Bread, the first night of it, the Leil Shimurim, the night to be much observed. It could be translated. And then I talked about how to count towards Pentecost in a talk I gave last week. And I'm grateful for the interest in it, because we want to observe the appointed times at the appropriate time. We want to be very respectful of the scriptures. And to better understand the chronological issues that come up around this season of the year, I want to talk about the watches during the night. In Old Testament times, there were 3 watches during the night. And so you had the first watch from 6 o'clock to 9 o'clock. Then you had the middle watch from 9 to midnight. You had 3 watches. So they were 4 hours each. There was only 3 of them, so they were 4 hours each. 3 times 4 is 12. I did pass math in high school and college. I had college math as well.
Really?
So anyway, 6 to 10 was the first watch. Then the middle watch was 10 to 2 o'clock in the morning, and then there was the morning watch, but it's still night, but yet it's the morning watch. It's from 2 a.m. to 6 p.m. And that's when they began to leave Egypt. They began to walk out of Egypt during the morning watch, but it was still night. So it was, if you call me up at 2 a.m., I might say, why are you calling so late, or why are you calling so early? Why are you calling in the middle of the night, or why are you calling so early in the morning? So keep that in mind about the 3 watches, and the fact that the final watch, the morning watch, could also be defined as night. It's between 2 and 6 a.m. Now I want to go to New Testament times, and there you have 4 watches. You have 6 to 9, 9 to 12, 12 to 3, and 3 to 6. And perhaps you can find that in Mark 13:35. Jesus says in Mark 13:35, watch therefore, be alert. If you're a watchman, you got to stay alert the whole time. Watch therefore, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming. In the evening, at midnight, at the crowing of the rooster, or in the morning. All through you got to watch all through the night, all through those 4 watches. Is that okay? Lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping, and what I say to you, I say to all, watch. So we have to be spiritually alert. We can't let down. As Luke tells us, my Lord delays his coming. No, we've got to be spiritually alert. But having a knowledge of the watches can help with understanding. Today I want to talk about between 2 festivals. The Israelites left Egypt, and they were marching towards Mount Sinai. So between the days of unleavened bread, the Passover holiday, and the next festival, the Festival of Weeks, or the Festival of the First Fruits, or the Festival of the Harvest. Of course, back then, the key thing about it is that it was the Festival of Weeks. There had to be 7 weeks, and then the 50th day was that festival. So in the New Testament, it's called the Festival of the 50th Day, or Pentecost. But those 2 festivals are linked, as I explained last week. During the days of unleavened bread, the first fruits of the barley harvest are offered. And then 7 weeks later, during the festival of Pentecost, the first fruits of the wheat harvest are offered. we begin to count towards Pentecost on the day during the days of unleavened bread when the wave sheaf was offered. And then the completion of the first fruits offerings is on Pentecost, the festival of first fruits, when the first fruits of the harvest are completed, barley and wheat, when the first fruits of the grains are offered up. We had one step, then two steps, and as I explained, if you go through and study it with commentaries, and you'll see that the first fruits of the barley harvest represented the risen Christ, and the first fruits of the wheat harvest represent the rising saints when he returns, the first fruits of humanity. Now, the Pharisees understood this, but I believe they made a mistake. Most Christians believe Pentecost is on Sunday. And if you look at Leviticus 23 and verse 15, as we count towards Pentecost, today, as I'm speaking, we're beginning the 14th day counting towards Pentecost. It's been 2 full weeks. And I want to go to the 15th verse of Leviticus 23. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath. That's Sunday, right? It's the day after the Sabbath. From the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Count 50 days. And the day after the 7th Sabbath, then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Eternal. So after you have 7 Sundays, 7 Saturdays, and then that 8th Sunday, the 50th day, is Pentecost. And the wave sheaf should always be offered during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that means if the first day of Unleavened Bread is Sunday, then you do it then, because you already sacrificed the lamb the day before. The lamb was sacrificed on Sabbath when Sabbath was the 14th of the first month. Of course, there's always offerings on the Sabbath. Every Sabbath there were offerings made. And on the 14th of Nisan, if it's the Sabbath, the regular Sabbath offerings would be made along with the lamb, the Passover lamb. Now the Pharisees decided differently. They decided that, and so if you look at a Jewish translation, it'll say that you count from the day after the day of rest. They won't say Sabbath here. They'll say day of rest, so that you can kind of interpret it to be the first day of unleavened bread, an annual day of rest. You might want to call it an annual Sabbath, okay? From the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, then instead of saying 7 Sabbaths, the Jewish translation will say 7 weeks shall be completed. So they take this word Sabbaths in the Hebrew and they make it out to be 7 weeks. They kind of stretch the meaning a bit. So in a way, they're putting a spin on it, and that's why, because they believe that the first holy day is the Sabbath being talked about. That means that they will always be counting towards Pentecost on the 2nd day of unleavened bread, the 16th day of the first month, which means Pentecost always comes out for them on the 6th day of the 3rd month, and that's the reason. And as I said, I beg to differ, and I explained why last week. So if you want to go back and study into that, and if you have any discussion you want to do on this, on how to count Pentecost, or on the Lord's Supper and when it should be, I'm going to be giving an interactive Bible study for the Congregational Fellowship of God in a few weeks. And later on, I'll give you the exact date, but it will be on a Friday night in May. And I'll let you know ahead of time if you want to join in on that Bible study. It won't be on this subject, but after the study, I leave it open for questions on anything. So we can have a discussion if you want. We can have an interactive Bible study. I did one some time back, which would be available through the Church of God Congregational Fellowship, which is based in Hartford, Wisconsin. I did a Bible study, had to do with prophecy and the identity of the lost tribes of Israel. If that's a subject that provokes your interest, you could check out that material there. And if that causes you to have questions, again, maybe you'll tune in on the next Bible study. I also want to say that I'm very grateful for the interest now developing around the Flare Church that Daniel, my son, is organizing. And we had a service last week, that was sent out electronically, and some of you attended electronically. And as far as I understand, in the morning of this Sabbath, which I guess that'll be April 22nd, 2023, there'll be a morning service that Flare will record, and by late morning out west, it would it'll be done around noon here. So about 1 o'clock it's finished, and then it's recorded and so on. So late morning out west it will be available, and through the the various time zones through the day it would be available. So I'm encouraging you to be, as we put out these Flare services, to join us, and let us know if you're ever in this area where you can literally be with us, not only online but actually be with us. We're looking forward to that. But I'm talking today about between the festivals. You see, as you know, the Israelites left Egypt and were heading towards the Promised Land, and there were lessons to be learned before they ever came to Mount Sinai. Before they ever left Egypt, they had the Passover sacrifice, and so that's covered in Exodus 12. So that shows the importance of that sacrifice, and why even in New Testament times we have a ritual which substitutes for it, which I've explained in the past, the Lord's Supper. So they had the Passover sacrifice before they ever left Egypt. And now, as they're traveling towards Mount Sinai, before the ratification of the Sinaitic covenant, before the books of the covenant are presented to them, the Ten Commandments and the other laws that are there as part of that package, Exodus 20 through 23, and then Exodus 24 is the ratification. Before all of that, they're all already introduced to a very important commandment of God that they're going to have formally given to them on Mount Sinai, from Mount Sinai, and the way it's done is by supernaturally feeding them, and there's a lot of lessons in that. I want to go to John 6. Many of you read this or had this read to you just recently, probably around Remembrance Night. And I want to go, this is a Passover season during the ministry of Jesus Christ, where he begins to talk about the ceremony that he was going to eventually introduce. And the way he worded it, it did, let's say, to use an expression, turn some people off. It was a controversial way he worded it. Let's go to John 6 and verse 48. Now let me say that Bethlehem was the city of David, and Jesus Christ was Davidic. He was the Messiah. He was both Davidic and divine. But he was born in Bethlehem, house of bread. And lechem, also meaning bread, also can mean food in general. In Arabic, I believe laha means meat. And in the Old King James, sometimes lechem is translated meat. Literally, it means bread. And so I guess there were wheat fields around Bethlehem, and it was called house of bread, and that's where he of course was born. And in John 6:48 he says, "I am the bread of life. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. This is the bread which came down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die." So you see that the manna in a way was a type of Christ. What was the manna about? Well, they gathered the manna in order for them to eat, in order for them to survive. So going out and getting the manna, you could say, was symbolic of your livelihood, what you do to survive. We need food, clothing, and shelter. Now their clothing was being taken care of then, and they had their temporary dwellings, tents evidently, as they went through the wilderness. But to feed themselves, they had to go out and collect manna. But manna was being provided for them supernaturally. And you see here that Jesus Christ was an antitype of the manna. So what we're being told is, as we seek our daily bread, as we live our lives, and deal with physical matters of survival. We should do so involving Christ in our lives. We should be living as disciples of Jesus Christ, and we should be not only concerned with our physical survival, but our spiritual well-being. So it's a combination. We are physical beings, and we have to be concerned with that. But ultimately, the first priority is spiritual. Matthew 6:33. But seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you. So it seems to me, the lesson of the manna. And he goes on to say, so it's a type of Jesus Christ, and it's telling us that Jesus Christ must be involved in our lives, in our physical lives as we go through life, doing whatever work we need to do. I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I give is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world. Well, what he's talking about there is the sacrifice. His sacrifice is essential. It's vital. God's plan is dependent upon the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. Our salvation depends on that. Of course, there's more to that, because now we need to follow Christ and be his disciples. The Jews therefore quarreled among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Well, they missed the point, but that wasn't the only thing that people missed the point about in terms of some of the things that he had to say. But the manna, as I said, gives us that lesson. And when Jesus Christ was tested by the devil, he resisted him with Deuteronomy 8:3. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And this was the lesson of the manna. Now the manna was kind of shiny, evidently. It was white and also sometimes a yellowish in color. And so when you think about light, when you think about fire, fire is sometimes yellowish, and the sun is kind of a whitish color and sometimes a yellowish color. And so the manna was a type of Christ, because Jesus Christ, if you were to see him now in vision, would be brilliant, shining like the sun. One of the problems we have in our culture is that when people think about Jesus Christ, they think about this hippie figure, or proto-hippie. He was around, these various paintings and sculptures were around long before the hippie movement of the 60s. But that's how he's made to look. Even though, Paul told the church in Corinth, it is a shame for a man to have long hair. Look at Orthodox Jews today. They cut their hair, men cut their hair military style, very short. When I was in the yeshiva, I didn't even need a comb. My hair was cut so short I didn't have to comb it. In fact, we didn't want to comb our hair. We thought it was vanity to comb your hair. Now, some Orthodox Jews have long side curls, yes. But that's, they still have very short hair on the top. They have these long side curls, which is I would think, being overzealous about a certain commandment in the Bible. But a person looking hippie-ish, like your typical visions that people have of Jesus Christ, he wouldn't have much credibility in an Orthodox Jewish environment as a normal person circulating around. Jesus was, after all, one who circulated around. He was the life of the party. He was very popular. He wasn't a figure like John the Baptist that was kind of scary, out there in the wilderness. He was one who interacted with people, and not only that, but he looked so normal, so average, that Judas had to kiss him, had to point him out. He wasn't that obvious. He wasn't, way taller than everybody else, or he didn't have this sort of glow coming out of him that, oh, he's the one. No, Judas had to point him out. So anyway, but let's take a brief discussion, or have a brief discussion about Jesus Christ as he is. Not the carpenter's son, not the rabbi, but Jesus Christ now. In Revelation 1 and verse 13, okay? John says, and in the midst of the seven lampstands, one like the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the feet, and girded about the chest with a golden band. His head and hair were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes like a flame of fire. So that's Jesus Christ if we were to see him now. And I think the manna, to some degree, was symbolic of that. It was whitish, and also I think yellowish at times. Maybe there were different varieties, or maybe depending how the light shined on it and so on. Anyway, we're going to talk about manna now. And they called it man in Hebrew, which is evidently a form of the word ma. Ma means what. Hebrew is an interesting language. You know, if you want, me means who, and who means he, and he means she, and dog is fish, and if you want a girl to come, you say boy. But anyway, ma is what in Hebrew, and man is what they called this food because they didn't know what it was. I'm in Exodus 16. And they journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, after they departed from the land of Egypt. Then the whole congregation from the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the children of Israel said to them, "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Isn't that sad? But you know, that is us if we're not careful. You know, all God had done for them, and they still didn't have the faith that He would care for them at this point. Look at what He did. I mean, these are people who've just crossed the Red Sea and seen the Egyptians drown, and these are the people who saw the 10 plagues in Egypt. But that's the way, you know, human nature goes. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not." So you see, it was a type of living day by day, according to the Word of God, consistently, day by day, day by day. Let's go to Deuteronomy 8, because I already told you, Jesus Christ quoted Deuteronomy 8:3. You see that in Matthew and in Luke. Matthew 4 and Luke 4. Matthew 4:4 and Luke 4:4, I believe. So let's go to Deuteronomy 8:3. I'm going to start from the beginning of that chapter. Deuteronomy 8. "Every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land which the Eternal swore to your fathers." So this is not a matter of saying, well, you know, if God wants us to do it, you know, we should do it because, you know, if it's important to God, it ought to be important to us. Well, that's true. But on the other hand, He's saying, for your own good you do this. I have a way of life for you. In other words, I want you to go from, you know, this point to that point. I want you to fulfill your potential. You know, ultimately, I want to make spirit beings out of you. So do what I tell you, because that's the only way to get where I want you to go. And of course, other ways lead to nowhere, to destruction ultimately. Anyway, so, "And you shall remember that the Eternal your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness to humble you and test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep His commandments or not." So He humbled you. It's hard for me to believe that I am where I am time-wise. I'm just getting into this talk. So anyway, so He humbled you, allowed you to hunger, and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you know, that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of the Lord. And as I told you earlier, their clothing was taken care of, but their food they had to go out and get. "Your garments did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell these 40 years. You should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Eternal your God chastens you." So a loving parent will punish a child for disobedience, and a loving God punishes His children for disobedience. because there is a way that leads to eternal life, and he wants us to be following that way. So anyway, to make a long story short, what I wanted to show you was, yes, the manna was very important, just from the point of view of the lesson that it gave, that we don't live by bread alone, by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. But there was another point to the manna. They got a double portion on Friday, and then on the Sabbath there wasn't any. So they were taught about the Sabbath here in Exodus 16. They were taught about the Sabbath before they ever got to Mount Sinai, and they were having to observe the Sabbath back here in Exodus 16. They weren't to go out after the manna on Sabbath. They were get a double portion on Friday. To this day, if you go to an Orthodox Jewish home on Friday night, they will have 2 loaves of challah, this egg bread that they bake for the Sabbath. They'll have 2 loaves there in honor of the double portion that is mentioned here in Exodus 16. And what's important is that Friday is, in that sense, a day of preparation. It's a preparation day. And he says in verse 26 of this chapter, 6 days you shall gather, but on the 7th day, the Sabbath, there will be none. And let's go back to verse 22. And so it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said to them, this is what the Lord has said. Tomorrow is the Sabbath rest, O holy Sabbath to the Eternal. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil, and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. So the point is that Friday is a preparation day for the Sabbath. So let's not neglect that. If we're going to keep the Sabbath, let's also remember that Friday is a preparation day. Sometimes people kind of what's the right word? Let the Sabbath sort of creep up on them without having really prepared. So remember, there ought to be preparation before the Sabbath. Friday is a preparation day. There was a senator who was a Sabbath keeper, a Jewish senator from my home state of Connecticut, Joseph Lieberman. He wrote a book about the Sabbath, and what he said is that the average, let's say, highfalutin, a person like he's a senator, but on Friday he becomes one who has to do menial work, preparing for Sabbath. Maybe he has to take out the trash or sweep the house or whatever he has to do. Each person in the family maybe has some assigned role to get the house ready, to get the family ready for the Sabbath. So it's a kind of humbling from week to week, in a way. Now I suppose, if you're very well to do, you might have a servant who would do it, and then the servant's supposed to rest on the Sabbath. But most people in America, they probably have to. And even Joseph Lieberman, maybe he could have afforded to have somebody else do it, but he would do some of the preparing himself. Now, if you go back to Genesis 2, you find the Sabbath already there. Early in Genesis, the Sabbath is already there. And very directly, to go back to the original Hebrew, there's no question what's being talked about there. You find it in Genesis 2. And if let's go to the account of Noah and the flood. And regarding Noah and the flood, I want to go to 7:4 of Genesis. So God says to Noah, I'm in verse 3. I want to go to verse 4. For after 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. He talks about 7 more days. And then you go to Genesis 8 and verse 7. Noah sends out a raven, okay? But then it goes and says he also sent out for himself or from himself a dove, to see if the waters had receded from the face of the ground. I'm in Genesis 8:9. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of her foot, so she returned into the ark to him, for the waters were on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her, and drew into the ark to himself. Maybe this took place in the course of a week, because you can read here, and he waited yet another 7 days. So maybe he had sent the dove out for a week. At the end of the week, the dove comes back. Then he waits another 7 days, and again he sent the dove out from the ark. Then the dove came to him in the evening, and behold, a freshly plucked olive leaf was in her mouth. And Noah knew that the waters had receded from the earth. So again, we have a 7-day period, ending with the dove coming back to rest. There's a beautiful song that Orthodox Jewish men sing on the Sabbath, and it talks about that on the Sabbath the dove found rest. It's probably going back to this account in Genesis. I'm tempted to sing it, but I'll spare you. But anyway, so you see the Sabbath is clearly there in Genesis 2 and implied in the account of Noah. And then in Exodus 16, before one ever gets to Mount Sinai, when they're between festivals, in effect, between unleavened bread and Pentecost, we have the Sabbath introduced, the weekly Sabbath introduced, and very strenuously enforced, so to speak. Moses is really angry when some people did go out and shouldn't have, and I guess I will read that. I'm coming to the conclusion of my talk, but I want to read that. Now it happened that some of the people went out on the 7th day to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws, you collectively? For the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you on the 6th day bread for 2 days. Let every man remain in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. And the house of Israel called its name manna, or man in the Hebrew. And it was like white coriander seed. And the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. There's another description given in Numbers 11. So you have to put them together to get the full account. Numbers 11 talks about it as well. And even though they were able to do so many things with the manna, and even though it was coming supernaturally from God day after day, even so, after a while they complained about it. They got bored with it, and again, it's unfortunate, but these are lessons that we need to learn from this account. We have to be careful that we don't fall into wrong attitudes and begin to take for granted the blessings of God's way of life. After a while they got tired of the manna and wanted something else. And when they got something else, they made, I guess you could say they made, to use the expression in English, they made pigs of themselves, and so they were punished as a result. So unfortunately, as we go through the wilderness journeys of the Israelites, we do find a lot of problems of human nature brought out, but also there's a lot of lessons to be learned on the positive side. The lesson of living our lives in such a way that God is with us. I remember there was a movie, a book, maybe it became a movie, God is my co-pilot. Of course, God is directing us and leading us as he did the Israelites, with a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. He doesn't do that in the same way, but we have his word, to study and to learn from. And as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10, the 10th chapter, I'm going to go to Mark 2, and then I'm going to go to 1 Corinthians 10 as I try to wind up this talk. So let's go to Mark 2, because it really ties in with Exodus 16 and Genesis 2. This is Mark 2 and verse 28. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for the Jew. It's not what he said. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. So the true Lord's Day, of course, is the Sabbath. as Saturday, as we call it in English, but in many other languages it is called Sabbath, and in many other languages it is. And Jesus said that the Sabbath was made for human beings. You find it in the beginning of the Bible. And I will turn back to Genesis 26, if you'll indulge me that, because look at Genesis 26, now that you've heard me talk about the Sabbath. Genesis 26 and verse 5. Well, I see verse 2, I see verse 5. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Well, it would seem to me that this indicates that Abraham knew a lot more than what we see in the book of Genesis about what God wanted him to do. So it very likely Abraham knew about the Sabbath. Very likely ancient man, at the time of the flood, knew about the Sabbath, and of course later abandoned it or perverted it. The ancient Babylonians had a kind of system similar to the Sabbath. It wasn't exactly the same, but it was similar. And that's why some scholars, I think, will say that somehow the Israelites picked it up from the Babylonians. No. What happened was that probably ancient human beings had the Sabbath, and in Mesopotamia, that's where civilization began, the Tower of Babel and so on. And from there, human beings spread around the world. But they began life in the area between the Tigris and Euphrates River. That began human history after the flood. They very likely had the Sabbath and kind of perverted it, and had something similar, but not quite exactly the same. And then, of course, later on, God revealed it to his people. And whatever you want to say about Genesis 26, in Exodus 16, it's clear. When the Israelites left Egypt, and before they got to Mount Sinai, God revealed to them about the Sabbath. And that may be one reason why in Exodus 20 it's worded the way it is. I want to go back to Exodus 20. When it comes to the Sabbath commandment, he says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So remember the Sabbath day might imply, I already told you about it, when 1 month after you got out of Egypt. Now it's a little bit later, it's almost 2 months after. So he's maybe implying, I already told you about it, remember it. So that's another comment to make. Now I want to go to 1 Corinthians 10. When we read the account of the Israelites in the wilderness, we should realize we are vulnerable to make some of those same mistakes if we're not careful. And he says in verse 6 of 1 Corinthians 10, the Apostle Paul, now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters as were some of them. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. And he goes on and discusses other matters. So it is our responsibility to, rather than following the negative examples that we see there, following the positive examples that are also there and through the Bible. Follow the positive points of the various heroes of the Bible and not copy their flaws. We have a saying in the Jewish community that if you take the worst habits of 10 righteous people, you'll wind up being very wicked. So none of us are perfect, but follow the positive examples. As Paul says, follow me, imitate me as I imitate Christ, right? 1 Corinthians, in fact, I'm already there, so I'll turn there. 1 Corinthians 11:1. Paul says, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. So between the festivals, the Israelites were being taught that life is not just the physical around us, but there is a higher, there is a spirit realm, a spiritual reality that we need to be aware of, because that's our ultimate destiny. Our ultimate destiny is to be spirit, to be immortal, to be sons and daughters of God. So let's keep this in mind as we go through this earthly existence. And along with that, one of the lessons, one of the ways that to help us along the way is, is the Sabbath. The Sabbath helps keeps us on track spiritually, heading in that direction, and it's a type of the rest that does occur to humanity when Jesus Christ returns. The millennium is a rest, and of course, once we become spirit, then of course that is also a rest from all the pains and all the ups and downs of physical life. So I'll finish with Hebrews, the 4th chapter. It talks about Psalm 95 and how the Israelites disappointed God, to say the least. And so therefore that generation didn't enter the promised land, their children did. So he says, let's not follow their wrong example, because we do want to enter the rest that God has in store for us. When the Jews keep the Sabbath, they call it Me'ein Olam Haba, a glimpse of the world to come. And so as we keep the Sabbath from week to week, we can remember that it's a type of the rest that will come to humanity when Jesus Christ returns and the saints are resurrected to rule under him. And then beyond that, it's a type of the ultimate rest where no longer will we have any pain at all, as Revelation tells us. That maybe I'll finish with that one. No, I'm going to read that one and then come back to Revelation, to Hebrews 4. But I am inspired to read Revelation 21. When it talks about life in the New Jerusalem, talk about a rest that really is a rest from human life. Revelation 21 and verse 4. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. There shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Then he who sat on the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. And he said to me, Write, for these words are true and faithful. And now I conclude then with Hebrews 4 and verse 9. And so there remains, therefore, sabbatismos, a Sabbath observance or a rest. There remains a rest for the people of God. There remains yet a future for us. The kingdom of God, the millennium, and ultimately beyond that, the New Jerusalem, the new heavens, and the new earth. And so as we keep the Sabbath from week to week, we can be better able as human beings to fulfill our incredible potential that God has in store for us. And as we read the account of the traveling of the Israelites in the wilderness, we can gain what God wants us to gain from the fact that he inspired the account to be written here and preserved, for us to study and to learn from. So if you want to go back and read some of those sections between Exodus 15 and Exodus 20, that gives you an account of the Israelites' 7 weeks journey between two festivals. All the best to you and yours.